Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome everybody to this One Planet Network webinar on 31st of March 2020. I am Fabienne Pierre. I work for the 10OFP Secretariat in UNEP, and so I'm welcoming you now to this webinar, which is dedicated today to sustainable consumption and production at the heart of the climate fight. I would really like to thank you all for joining us today. We know this is a very special time, and we are all living in unprecedented situation. Still today, we have about 500 registered participants, and we have many people keep on joining us while I'm talking right now. So thank you all for your presence and engagement. Thank you really for that. Just a really quick message to let you know that the 10OFP Secretariat, which is based in Paris, is working remotely, but it is our objective to keep offering you this platform for exchanging and sharing experience and knowledge in the most useful way now and in the near future. So I'm not going to take much more time for this introduction because today we have two very interesting presentations, and we would like to keep some time for questions and answers. Just in practical terms, given that we have so many participants today, we won't be able to take questions through audio, but I would like to really encourage you to leave comments and questions using the questions box that you should see in the menu of the GoToWebinar tool, or the chat if you would like to. So please don't hesitate, and after our two presentations, we will have some time for exchanging. So without further delay, I will introduce our presenters for today and quickly sorry, I'm trying to share my screen. Yes. So our agenda for today, we will have a first presentation from Ms. Maria Jose Batista from the International Resource Panel Secretariat in UNEP on resource efficiency and climate change, material efficiency strategies for a low carbon future, which is a very recent report that was released, and she will share with you main findings and conclusions of that report. And while we will be talking about how science is critical in helping us addressing those major global challenges we are facing, we will then have a presentation from Ms. Beatriz Martins Carnero from UNEP, as well, representing the Consumer Information for SCP program of the One Planet Network on consumer information tools and climate-friendly behavior. So from the science and how science can support and inform policy decisions to our everyday life, and how we can inform consumers also on a daily basis on how to contribute and how to together contribute to this fight against climate change. So with no further delay, I will ask my colleague Maria Jose Batista to take the floor and start her presentation. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here to present some of the findings of a new report launched by the International Resource Panel. My name is Maria Jose Baptista, and I work for the Secretariat of the IRP, which is hosted by UNEP in our offices in Paris. I wanted to start with a very simple reflection. We basically all use natural resources. We have many things in common, actually. We, especially in these challenging times, one of them, a very basic thing, is that we depend on the state, the access and availability that we may have of natural resources. So to drink, to eat, to communicate, to connect, to breathe, to keep ourselves clean, we need water, we need mineral resources, we need clean air, and we need productive and resilient land, among other things. So our health depends on the health of the environment. And I think that very often we forget the natural resources are not limitless. Scarcity is indeed the business as usual in many parts of the world. In other parts, it's more about unequal distribution or access. And in many parts of the world, it's about the environmental impacts that are generated from extracting those resources, consuming them, or disposing of them. And all of this is growing at an accelerated pace. So to answer the questions, very basic ones, like what do we have and how are we managing it? What are the impacts of the management of those resources? What actions can we take to ensure quality, access, availability? We created the International Resource Panel back in 2007, and it was more or less launched with the idea of creating a science-based policy interface on the sustainable use of natural resources, and in particular their environmental impacts over the full life cycle. So like the IPCC does for climate change and IPBES for biodiversity loss, we focus on natural resources and on ways in which we can improve efficiency. We work, it's a very quick overview of how we work so you understand. We have three main bodies. It's the scientific panel composed by 35 scientists from all over the world, a steering committee with governments, the European Commission and UNEP, the secretariat hosted by UNEP, and all of these interact at different key moments. It's an independent scientific panel. That means that reports like the one I'm going to present today are developed by the scientific panel, but they're based on policy questions that are raised by the government. So it is, we try to make research that is policy relevant. And governments, of course, do not interfere in the development of the content, but they can provide recommendations to ensure that policy relevance. And reports go through a very thorough internal and external review process, and they usually take between 1 to 3 years in being completed, which was the case for this particular one. We also work with a series of strategic partners, some of which are on your screen at different moments, from the co-creation of some pieces to dissemination and outreach. So we can reach different core key stakeholders for us. And speaking of, one of them is the G7. The G7 is a knowledge, we are a knowledge provider, the IRP for the G7 on sustainable resource management. And indeed, actually in 2017, we published a report that they had commissioned to us, exploring what the potential and economic implications of resource efficiency were. So it provided evidence that showed that if we increase resource efficiency, it's not only practically attainable, but it contributes also to economic growth, creating jobs, and even to climate change strategies. As a follow-up to this work, the G7 asked us to zoom into the contributions of resource efficiency to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And this is when, this is how it all started. What I'm showing here is a screenshot from an article that came out some months ago in The Guardian with a very direct title and, worrisome title that tells us that the world's consumption of materials hits 100 billion tons a year. And this is from a report called the Circularity Gap Report, to which our co-chair contributed, and this number actually comes from our work. So why do we focus on materials? Well, that's one of the reasons why. This is another one. Emissions actually from the production of materials as a share of global GHGs increased from 15% in 1995 to 23% in 2015. And this actually corresponds to the share of GHG emissions from agriculture, forestry, and land use change all combined. But they have not received a lot of attention. You will see here that most of the emissions actually come from the production of iron and steel, cement, lime, plaster, and other non-metallic minerals. So in global climate change mitigation efforts have traditionally focused on improving energy efficiency and accelerating the transition to renewables. This is key. We need to pay, however, greater attention to material efficiency. It's an opportunity. And also without it, actually, it will be very difficult and more expensive to keep global warming below the 1.5 degree target. So using materials more efficiently down the value chain is the most direct measure to reduce emissions, actually, and the technologies are available today. They bring co-benefits with operational emission savings as well. IRP authors assessed in this report mitigation potential in two specific sectors: residential buildings and light-duty vehicles. Why did we choose these sectors? Most materials are used in two industries, actually: construction and machinery or manufacturing. And within these sectors, vehicles or cars and houses are particularly important because they use large amounts of materials, they provide essential services to society, they create high value in the economy, and they show significant potential for system-wide efficiency increases. So those were the reasons why we focused on these two. Now, how do we improve system-wide efficiency in these two sectors? 7 strategies are important here, and those are the strategies that were assessed through modeling by our scientists. Using less material by design, so leaner design, for example, leaner load-bearing structures and buildings, material substitution from cement to wood for some houses, for example, fabrication yield improvements, the traditional efficiency that reduces waste in the manufacturing process or improves scrap reuse, more intensive use, which refers to the overall smarter use of a car or house. It means, for example, that floor space is used without rooms that are not really being used, or buildings do not remain empty. It can reduce the total floor space needed in a country without hampering the quality of life, basically. In cars, this means that the existing cars are used to their maximum capacity through, for example, carpooling models. Then we have the product lifetime extension, or better repair and maintenance of buildings or cars. Remanufacturing and reuse of components prolongs the lifetime of these components in the same or another vehicle or house. And then the enhanced end-of-life recovery and recycling of materials, for example, the recycling of steel or a discarded car. So in the report, just so you understand when I'm referring to different kinds of emissions, we have developed a bottoms-up modeling framework based on the life cycle analysis principles. And it considers this model, the mitigation potential along the life cycle of the car or the house, including possible trade-offs. And it looks specifically into different kinds of emissions. So on your screen, you have these. You have what we call the material cycle emissions, are those emissions caused by the production of materials for houses and cars. You also have the life cycle emissions, the emissions from the production and operation of those cars and houses, mainly from heating and fuel needs. You also have the annual emissions, that mean emissions from 2016 to 2050. And then cumulative emissions were also looked at, and these were considered between 2016 and 2060. This, of course, depended on available data. So this is why the periods of the annual emissions are only up to 2050, and then the cumulative ones until 2060. So let's go into the results. Here we have first the annual emissions of homes in 2016. This is not a scenario, it's the reality today, or it was in 2016. And both material emissions here in orange, the material cycle emissions, are significant, as well as the emissions that come from heating and cooling of houses, which is what we refer to as emissions from operational energy use here in green. Now, in this second one, this is a scenario and it's for 2050. This scenario assumes a reduced building rate in 2050 in comparison to 2016, as most houses, and this is again material efficiency strategies applied in the G7 countries, and actually we see here that most houses by 2050 in the G7 will have been built, and building is mainly about replacing. Also, this reference scenario includes very ambitious energy measures, so high action on insulation and clean energy supply. However, even with these measures, the emissions are still over 700 million tons in 2050 per year. So we have the third bar shows us that material efficiency strategies in the G7 could reduce 35% of life cycle emissions from homes in G7 countries in 2050. So on top of all of those energy measures, we apply these material efficiency strategies, and we can see this further reduction. And almost 100% of the remaining material emissions are gone. Let's look at China and India. So material efficiency strategies here could reduce up to 60% of life cycle emissions from homes. And again, you see the new building today, 2016, is very high, and so are the emissions, as you can see here. Now, new buildings in China and India will peak sometime between 2016 and 2050. So the annual emissions from materials are lower in 2050 than they are today. Cooling and heating emissions are substantial despite ambitious energy measures and the transition to clean energy. But if we apply on top of this scenario the material efficiency strategies, we can significantly reduce material emissions and operational emissions too. So overall emissions are more than halved actually, and material emissions are reduced to a fifth of the scenario, of the reference scenario that we had. When we talk about what specific material efficiency strategies worked here in the home sector, in the house sector, we say basically the top ones are more intensive use and recycling. So more intensive use of homes, as I was saying before, you eliminate the underutilization of essentially wasted space. You could save by far the most emissions with this strategy. The better use of space means less need for new buildings and freed materials that could be reused for other purposes if we have the recycling capabilities. More intensive use of a home can also significantly reduce heating needs, and wood use can reduce cooling needs. So the use of recycled materials is very important as well. as well, and also the use of renewable materials such as sustainably sourced wood. Leaner design has less impact in G7 countries where new building needs are low. It would have more of an impact on the growing countries or growing building infrastructure in countries like China, like India. It is interesting to note that most of the strategies predominantly reduce the need for virgin materials and connected emissions, actually. Let's go into cars. Let's see what happens with cars in the model that they developed. So material efficiency strategies could reduce between 30 and 40% of life cycle emissions from cars in G7 countries in 2050. The first here bar you see again the emissions from the fleet in 2016, where the emissions from the production of materials is in gray. You see it is not, way more emissions come from the operational energy use. Material emissions are significant still with 30 million tons, but they are very small in comparison to the massive fuel emissions in blue. And you have in 2050, the reference scenario assumes more electric vehicles and more public transport. So emissions have more than halved, basically. This is already an ambitious scenario in terms of energy measures. But what happens if we, on top of that, apply material efficiency strategies? We see that there's a reduction of up to 40%, between 30 and 40%. And in China and India, the savings are up to 35%. You can see them here on your screen. And you see that today the vehicle emissions are quite low, mainly determined by a very small number of cars per capita in India. In 2050, the number is expected to grow massively, and obviously the emissions that come with it. And then we apply material efficiency strategies. The emissions from the total car fleet in India and China would still rise, but much less than in the reference scenario. The implication is really to design and plan an efficient mobility system in these countries today so that this can happen. And what are the strategies that work the best? The strategies that work the best here basically were more intensive use, cleaner vehicles, and recycling. And when looking at these, you could see that most of the strategies reduce materials and operational emissions by reducing the number of cars and making vehicles lighter. It is clear that ride sharing or also pooling, for example, a shuttle model or Uber pool type model would have massive benefits. Using cars from shared fleets for individual rides would also be beneficial, and so would be using more need appropriate vehicle size. And for individual use, this would mean smaller vehicles. For shared use, this would mean lean, comfortable cars optimized for their passenger number. Better recycling and maintenance is important too and could become more beneficial when more intensive use models require more maintenance and upgrading. So I mentioned cumulative savings or cumulative emissions were also explored in this report. And overall, in the model, all strategies in both sectors together would reduce G7 emissions by 20 gigatons, so about 20%. In India and China, this would be 36 gigatons, about 25% of the emissions. Given that the entire carbon budget, for instance, for G7 countries by 2060 is 50 gigatons, these reductions are clearly not enough. But actually, for the 1.5 degree target, all material efficiency strategies need to be implemented as fast and extensively as possible. And we have to combine these measures with other ambitious measures like deep energy retrofitting of buildings or shift from private to public transport, fast introduction of electric vehicles and clean energy, innovation in low carbon materials production. Those were some of the conclusions. We also did, as part of the report, a review of policies around the world that would somehow connect resource efficiency and climate change, in looking at both these angles, seeing how we can reduce GHG emissions through both of these angles. And while material efficiency policies exist around the world, they are mostly not focused on climate impacts. And vice versa, climate policies often ignore the materials perspective. So for material efficiency policies, we see that they are often targeting end-of-life products and their material recycling, actually. And while this is important, a main lever in the design of products for better use and reusability. We need for better GHG impact, and really that should be more the focus. So current material related policies focus mostly on this end of life, but the design of houses and vehicles is a key point of leverage for GHG impact, actually. We found out from the review that despite the overall gap, a few interesting examples can be cited and presented, and they are included in the report. For example, building codes are in principle an effective policy tool, and their upgrading for material efficiency considerations could be a powerful tool, actually. Also, zoning laws currently often present a barrier to space-efficient housing, mandating single-family houses in certain areas, for instance. The revision of these is important, and some examples can be studied. In terms of mobility, it's important to promote higher use of vehicles. Policy examples include lanes reserved for high occupancy vehicles, for instance, permit and fee regulations, often at the city level, that discourage individual car use, actually, particularly in ride hailing, and promote fare pooling models. And finally, my last slide, policies that apply across sectors may have more impact than those focusing on one sector. And you see some examples of cross-cutting policies for material efficiency on your screen. The use of building certification systems, green public procurement, virgin material taxation, removal of virgin resource subsidies, or recycled content mandates, including also the nationally determined contributions of the Paris Agreement. And that is it. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Maria Jose. I hope everybody can hear me properly. Maria Jose, we have received a number of questions during this very interesting presentation that you just gave. So maybe before moving to the next presentation, we can try to answer a couple of them, which are very specific to this report and methodology that you presented. So one question that came up is about the scientific methodology that is being used to actually measure the effectiveness of the proposed material efficiency strategies. Do you have a bit more information on that? And then another question, which is also about the methodology, is whether the report has considered to research the shift to different mobility systems well, you did talk about using less cars and public transportation systems, but did it go a little bit more in detail, or do you know about other resources that analyze this more closely in the context of different urban models? Um, can you maybe try to answer those two questions?
Yes, sure. Thank you for those very good questions.
Thanks.
So, do you still see my screen? Not necessarily. Okay. Even if you don't see it, just explaining a little bit the methodology that we use to estimate the potential of these material efficiency strategies. The authors actually developed what we call a bottoms-up modeling framework. So they use a series of assumptions, policy assumptions, and assumptions of certain things happening in within a certain period of time, like electrification or some energy packages according to the energy transitions that are starting to happen today. So they have a series of assumptions that they first have to define, and this gives you the boundaries of what will go into the model that they will develop with numbers. And those numbers, some of them are taken from other existing models, like the ones that IPCC develops or the Atomic Agency, the IAEA develops. And basically, we call it a bottoms up because we are looking at first actually a specific sector as opposed to more general statements. We look into that sector and we look at the life cycle of that product, of the car or the house. And we basically look at data from different kinds of emissions as the ones that I was explaining during my presentation. And so we have a baseline, which is with numbers that we know, so 2016, and then they do estimates or calculations with certain assumptions, again, of certain policy packages passing for specific years like 2050. So that is how they determine. In those assumptions, they assume one or more of these material efficiency strategies are implemented. That is more or less in a nutshell what the methodology they use to determine the potential of each material efficiency strategy. So just I forgot to mention that we launched the summary of this report at the COP in Madrid, and it was only a summary, and the full report, including a very detailed technical annex explaining what assumptions they made and what numbers they used for that modeling they developed, will be out or launched hopefully by June. And then the second question, we did not look at services as a whole. So what would happen to the mobility system and to we really looked at the specific sector. And yes, some of the assumptions are about the mobility system of that sector, but it is true that more analysis needs to be done on that regard. We do not have any plans for the moment to extend the analysis, but it is something that will be discussed within the panel. So basically, how to follow up this work this year. Not that we're going to do something this year, we're going to discuss what the follow-up of this report will be this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Jose. So we are gonna have to move to the next presentation, but I want to reassure everybody that we are recording this webinar, and we will be sharing the slides with all of you through our website. Yeah, the conversation can continue online. Obviously, we had a question that is actually a very good transition to our next presentation. Is how can we involve consumers as part of the solutions? So to help us answer that question, I will ask my colleague Beatriz Martins Carnero to share with us her presentation. I will make you a presenter, Beatriz, so you can start right away. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabienne. Can you hear me well?
You sound a little bit far from your microphone.
Oh, that's bad. Let me see. Is it better now? Oh. Hear me? Okay, so
Yes, we can hear you, Beatriz. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you, Fabienne. Thank you, Maria Jose, for giving this very interesting presentation. So my name is Beatriz, and I work at UNEP at the Consumption and Production Unit, leading the work on consumer information and eco-labeling. And today, I will present our newly launched report on consumer information tools and climate change, facilitating low carbon choices in tourism, buildings, and food systems. The report was developed in the context of the One Planet Network, led by One Planet Network. It was led by UNEP and the Consumer Information Program. We count on the support of the three other programs: the Sustainable Buildings and Constructions, Sustainable Food Systems, and Sustainable Tourism programs. This report was made possible by the support of the Federal Ministry for the Environment of Germany through the International Climate Initiative. So I will start by setting the scene and the 1.5 degrees Celsius challenge. It's known that the national determined contributions as currently pledged are insufficient to meet the mitigation challenge that we have now. 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius is the maximum warming goals that will to keep the maximum warming goals between 1.5 and 2.0 degrees Celsius will require fundamental changes in global consumption and production patterns. So, mitigating climate is one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that are the cornerstones of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Global warming, as it stands today, is likely to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius between 2030 and 2051 if it continues to increase at the current rate. High-emitting countries on a per capita basis are expected to make more significant mitigation pledges and to implement absolute economy-wide reduction targets. And national approach to mitigation have usually focused on production. Very few things have been done from the consumption point of view, and this is what we are trying to encourage by this report. Also, technology is already known that technology change alone is not sufficient to achieve the efficiency gains needed to cope with the 1.5 challenge. Command and control, as well as market-based measures, need to be continued and enhanced. Behavior change is a key element in mitigation. There are, of course, large differences in individual contributions to GHG emissions. Some challenge to this approach is that the analysis of supply and value chains is complex and characterized by lack of data in many sectors. Consumers and corporate stakeholders have difficulties in considering the effects of their choices down the supply chain. Any change in one aspect of production can have a great influence on overall supply chain, and this can be actually a challenge, but also an opportunity, especially in the food system supply chain. And information systems should consider the entire life cycle of assessed products and services. So these are some of the challenges we face in implementing the policies and command and control, and also behavior change to foster mitigation. So consumer information are tools and systems that guide consumers to make more sustainable choices. They can stimulate behavior change. There is evidence that informational campaigns and certifications do affect choices, and that these can be improved in their efficiency. Information tools include carbon certifications, rankings, comparing business standards, or other educational tools such as dedicated websites. Information tools should work towards three interrelated goals, being to inform about product carbon characteristics, to inspire low carbon choices, and to increase carbon literacy among consumers. Also, information tools should consider factual, procedure, and effective knowledge, should appeal to a cognitive, experiential, and normative dimensions of behavior, and should consider injunctive norms. As I mentioned, they are soft policies instruments to raise awareness, create knowledge, inform about implications of behavior, highlight opportunities, and help companies to adapt production process by following criteria for certification schemes. This is specifically the case of labels and certification schemes. So the most common information tool on CO2 emissions is carbon labels. The characteristics of carbon labels is to focus on energy use and emissions of greenhouse gases, commonly used as tools for policy and marketing or to guide consumer decisions, help companies to benchmark products or services and to improve performance, and mostly depict carbon impacts in terms of weight or color schemes. This is what we find most in the market. Some of the challenges related to carbon labels is to identify common system boundaries that make carbon labels comparative. Today we find in the market very different types of labels, and it's very hard for the consumer to know if this information is comparable or not, and even if it's comparable, what it means, for example, to have a carbon footprint in the packaging of a product. So is this amount of carbon high, low, medium, and how can, so it's very hard for the consumer sometimes to understand this information. Yeah, so to develop certifications is also a challenge that optimized in terms of appeal, design, and address various knowledge dimensions. So it's very hard to convey a multi-criteria, multi-dimension labels on different impacts on sustainability, and also to cover a greater number of items and become more visible in consumption context. So achieve market penetration. We see that with few exemptions, it's what we see is that labels, carbon labels or labels in general, don't have a very broad market penetration in terms of the brands that use and also the range of products and services that are covered by those types of consumer information. And lastly, a challenge is to increase carbon literacy. So how can you provide an information to the consumer that is at the same time appealing and fostering behavior change, but also that the consumer can understand what is being said without feeling overwhelmed or confused. So those are some examples of carbon labels that are in the market. You can see that some of them, they work better than others. And can have a different impact on consumer literacy and also in fostering behavior change. So in terms of carbon footprint, it's widely used, but it's unclear how its effectiveness compares to other labels, because although it brings some carbon footprint, brings very relevant and reliable information, the consumer normally feels confused and doesn't understand very well how this information is relevant and how they can react upon this information. The other are two different designs on traffic light labeling. So design A is considered more effective than design B, because in design A, although we use the same color range, the traffic light type of labeling, in design A, you have like the green is good for the climate and the red is bad for the climate. So it's provide more intuitive information for the consumer. Both they bring the factual information on the amount of emissions associated with the product, but it seems to work better for the consumer design A because of the intuitive information. Just a second. It's not working. So information tools. So what is the influence of information tools on consumer behavior? So social norms have the greatest potential to influence behaviors. Information tools must overcome significant psychological barriers, and consumers are more averse to command and control and market-based measures, making policymakers more inclined to rely on voluntary change. So to optimize consumer information tools to increase their efficiency by considering the complexity of consumer psychology, including gender norms. Some examples of consumer information tools that can guide consumer decisions, I already mentioned, such as carbon certifications, business climate performance rankings, dedicated applications and websites, and increased carbon literacy, knowledge regarding the causes of climate change, and things like this. And also to demonstrate opportunities for low carbon cultures and lifestyles. There are 5 dimensions of desirable change in consumer behavior. One is avoidance, is to lead the consumer to avoid this purchase of this consumption act. So not consume specific items at all. The second one is to shift, to use products that are comparably less carbon intense. 3 is saving, use products over longer time frames before replacing them. So here we have the strategies of product lifetime extension and the avoidance of premature obsolescence. 4, consideration, to induce spillover effects, so one behavior influencing others. And 5, vote, to empower political parties that advocate policies to reduce consumption or increase pressure on business to decarbonize production. So here are some examples on how we can change social norms. So soft policies and voluntary change, like as public debate, advertisement, and information tools. Command and control, legislation, such as like flying at lower speeds, standards that, for example, brings the energy intense of the cars, for example, to have the ones that are more efficient. Also technology, use alternative fuels, and also market-based approach, emission trading, pricing carbon, taxation, air passengers for flights, to have extra taxation to actually bring up the externalities that are in the products or services, and also performance like slots to cleaner airlines. This would be a performance measure that could actually affect the behavior of consumers. Okay, so this is an example of a very recent change in social norms, which started in Sweden due to the action of climate activists. What is being called a flight shame led to a decrease in the number of domestic flights in Sweden in the years 2018 and 2019. So flying is one of the most energy-intense human activity in the world. And frequent flyers are now being seen as waiting, or at least in Sweden, because of the flight shame and all this campaign led by the climate activists. So the frequent flyers are now being seen as weighting personal benefits over wider societal goals. So this is one example of how the social norms can influence individual behavior. So to go more concrete in this report, we decided to focus on consumer information tools in three main sectors. So which are tourism, food systems, and buildings and constructions. Those are the same sectors that we take into account in the One Planet network. And all three sectors account for 52 of energy-related CO2 emissions as of today. All three sectors are also characterized by rapid growth in emissions levels. The tourism sector alone accounts for 4.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. 1.8 billion international tourist arrivals are expected in 2030. So it's a rapid growing sector, as I mentioned. Food systems alone accounts for 10 to 12 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. And emissions need to decline by 1 gigaton per year by 2030 for global warming to stay below the 2 degrees Celsius in 2100. And buildings accounts for 9.2 gigatons of CO2 equivalent in 2010. If you include construction-related emissions, the sector accounts for almost 39% of global energy-related CO2 emissions. So, in the tourism sector, there is a range of tourism information tools. The review for this report led to the identification of 57 tourism-specific labels. The Global Sustainable Tourism Council establishes and manages global sustainability standards, destination criteria for public policy makers and destination managers, also industry criteria for hotels and tour operators, and also they lead the European ecotourism labeling standards. There is a need to discuss whether different SDGs goals can be integrated in one certification and whether climate change deserves a specific attention in the tourism sector. So some of the challenges with the use of consumer information tools in the tourism sectors are that certification tools currently have limited importance for tourist decision-making. What defines sustainability is not always globally generalizable and varies depending on geography and local conditions. Tourists are confused by various certifications and labels, which are often not comparable. So more business need to be involved and certification schemes be adopted more widely. The number should be reduced, and also to increase the recognition value of certifications. And certifications can cover several aspects of a trip or be specifically focused on individual elements of a holiday. For example, the flights, for example. But it's proved that certifications addressing quality aspects are very effective in the tourism sector. So one opportunity here is to combine consumer information tools for awareness of climate change should be aligned with the of certifications addressing quality aspects. These are the some examples of consumer information tools in the sector, but I will not spend much time on this, just for. In the food system sector, the expanding demand is a major driver in the development of the global food system sector. Emissions occur at every stage of food production and consumption, and the carbon intensity of food systems is increasing. These are opportunities for mitigation on the supply side. There are opportunities for mitigation on supply side and also on demand side. Demand side reductions could include food loss, waste minimization, and changes in diet. So this is what is in target 12.3 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is to have per capita global food waste at the retailer and consumer levels and reduce food losses along production and supply chains, including post-harvest losses. So within this target, we see opportunities for mitigation on supply side and also on demand side. The urbanization, industrialization, market liberation, growing incomes, and changes in consumer attitudes contribute to changes in food consumption patterns. Mainly the westernization of food cultures, the increased intake of meat, fat, processed foods, sugar, and salt, and the higher share of animal protein contributes to the increase in carbon intensity of food systems. Some challenges using consumer information tools in the system is it's a complex system, includes financial services, governance, regulations, wholesalers, waste management and recycling, restaurants, and the global agro-food industry. 61% of emissions are production related. Cost is the most important factor when considering food purchases, which encourages the industrialization and globalization of food production, which may lead to increase in carbon intensity of food. Large corporations support market concentration and force producers to reduce production costs, and reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are possible in production, trade, food processing, retailing, and consumption.
Beatrice, this is
Yes.
Fabienne. Can I kindly ask you to maybe conclude in 2 minutes so we can have a little bit of time for questions? Thank you.
I'll do my best, but not realistic. But let's go. So so this is the consumer information tools for the food system. Is the information tools have a significant influence on behavior in the food sector. Certifications addressing personal health aspects are very effective, and 2 dimensions to compare carbon intensity. Identical products can be distinguished in terms of carbon impact on the basis of comparative assessments, and foodstuffs vary greatly in terms of their absolute carbon footprint. So it's known by the studies that local claims are very effective to consumers. They are like the locally produced, they are more popular than organic. They are associated with benefits to farmers. They are considered better for local economy. They seem to imply a short transport distance, and they consider better for the environment, and they associate quality and health. So can local claims be meaningfully combined with more climate-friendly choices? So this could be an opportunity to have better consumer information regarding food systems. Okay, so let's skip those. In buildings, there are many certifications addressing economic benefits in buildings, and they are very effective. Labels certifying energy efficiency may increase property value. The general effect of energy performance certificates have been confirmed, showing that higher energy efficiency ratings result in an increase of market value. So this is the type of consumer information that is considered effective in the building sectors. So as the IRP report said, operational energy use efficiency in buildings have a good potential of GHG emissions, and those can be fostered through the use of consumer information tools. Very few labels and consumer information tools in the buildings and construction sectors are actually aiming to the individual consumer. And this could be a very good opportunity for us to integrate this, also this aspect in consumer information. Okay, so I will skip very quickly. These are some of the existing tools. They include, they can also add decision making when call for tenders for public constructions works are made. So this is one way of using certifications and labeling schemes. And also for projects, performance criteria can be defined in tender criteria and contract conditions using the existing labels and certifications that are in the market. Here again, the energy performance certificate associates an economic benefit with the energy efficiency standard and increases the attractiveness of low energy housing. Okay, so the overall challenges and the barriers to change are that information tools have greater relevance for some forms of consumption, not much for others. Specific carbon information tools should be developed for each of the different sectors and sometimes subsectors or individual activities, such as air travel. Where certifications can be meaningfully combined to address several sustainability dimensions, these may also help making these more attractive, simultaneously reducing the overall number of certifications. Short-term outcomes should be distinguished from longer-term effects, and also existing certifications are not optimized in their appeal designs, as we mentioned before. So to enable change, we came up with 6 strategies that can support the development, outreach, and effectiveness of climate change related consumer information. So those are my 2 last slides. So increasing the scope of carbon certifications, efforts should be made to include carbon information, for example, in air travel sales platforms, to make airlines as well as individual flights comparable on the basis of emissions, support organizations such as the UNWTO in paramount this endeavor, and governments may provide incentives for particular small enterprises struggling with the cost of labeling schemes. Second, mainstream carbon certification, make information tools available to a broader audience. Government needs to set a regulatory context, facilitating and inspiring better decision making, and make information tools more visible, searchable, and easily identifiable. Information tools must be harmonized, align the information tools to make them comparable. Increasing carbon literacy, So carbon literacy is potentially as important as actual changes in behavior. Many consumers may not be ready to make personal adjustments to their lifestyles, but educated on the problem, they may be willing to support legislation enforcing changes, for example. Certifications and information tools can be optimized. So to associate consumer information tools with personal benefits in the tourism sector, to connect to higher quality, in the food systems to connect with lower costs or local and regional production, and in the buildings to connect with the energy costs, and to provide factual, procedural, and effective knowledge. And lastly, development of new carbon information tools. Rankings are powerful mechanisms to complement information tools. Websites and apps can make low carbon choices comparable, and contests generate media headlines and influence public disclosure. So with this, I conclude my presentation, and we can now go to the questions. And
Thank you
sorry
very
for
much.
extending my time a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Beatrice. Well, unfortunately, we won't have so much time for questions, but let me try to synthesize a little bit. Well, first of all, just to say that both your presentation and the previous presentation really illustrate the importance of the life cycle approach and eco-design in general terms. It's key in really developing also science-based information tools, as you illustrated. And your presentation also really shows clearly the challenge that translating this knowledge into intuitive, transparent, credible, and clear information represents. So we have a number of questions, many questions actually, and maybe let's focus on the food example because that's where we have most questions. And then I would encourage all participants to really look at this report and reach out to you, Beatrice, if you want to know more and have more examples in other sectors. But so the questions that we have, and I'll give them to you in group, let's say. First question is, do we have any idea which labels are being more easily accepted and why by consumers? Do we know also, or do we have recommendations on what can help consumers assess the credibility of labels and claims, because there are so many? So are there any principles or elements to look at when it comes to the credibility of those labels and claims? There is also an interesting question on whether labels influence prices of food products. Do we have examples, or do we have any information on how the consumer information tools can also affect the price of products? And the last question on that, and please, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to keep the answers short because I have one last question for you and Maria Jose after that. But it's also an interesting question. Do you know of any example in the world where advertising has been regulated for products that have a strong impact on the environment and climate change, for instance? There are examples of advertising being regulated for food products, for instance, or for products that are targeted at children. So do you have any example of that sort for products that have a big impact on the environment? Thanks.
Thank you, Fabienne. Wow, very many questions. Yeah, I will be brief. So the question on which labels are easily more accepted. This is what we try to convey with this presentation, that in the tourism sector, the labels that imply higher quality are the most accepted and effective towards the consumer. In the food systems, is the labels of locally produced are the ones that are more effective to the consumers. And in the buildings and construction sectors, the labels on energy efficiency are the ones that have more impact on the consumer behavior, and they actually have the effect of increasing market property value. So those are the three in each of the sectors that are most that work more effectively. So the second one, the credibility of labels and claims. So we have the ISO standards. They have a classification of standards. It says ISO 14020 series, where they classify. Those are standards that actually regulate the standards and the labels and the certifications. And I would say that the labels that are more credible are the ones that are third-party certified, which is what we call type 1 eco labels or type 1 like eco labels. They are the most trusted ones, I would say. There is one, the ITC International, they have a tool which is called Standards Map, where you can actually assess different labels and standards and to compare them to see which ones have cover which criteria or which requirements. So this is a good tool to assess also what kind of credibility level the standard or the label that you're dealing with have. So I suggest you take a look at this, and also to go for type 1 eco labels, which are the ones that are third-party certified. So can labels influence prices? I cannot, I don't have any information on this. We didn't do any assessment on this. I think it is perceived by the consumer that some labels or the organic, they influence on prices, but I don't have, I cannot say that. So I don't know. So advertising that regulate, no, I'm not aware of any regulations that keep the production or the business, the companies to advertise on products that have environmental impact or climate change impacts. What we have is many countries, they have mandatory they have regulations to become mandatory information on energy efficiency of appliances, of cars. So this is more or less a way of making mandatory to disclose the information on, for example, energy efficiency or water efficiency to the consumers for the products that normally are more energy or water intense. Yeah, and this, I think I responded to all. And please feel free to contact me, to drop me a line if you need more information in any of those aspects.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. And before I go to the last question to both you and Maria Jose, I want to mention a question that we are being asked regarding the fact that some companies and governments might want to put on hold their GHG emissions reduction goals to recover from the economic crisis and the ongoing pandemic. I just to say that this is of course this is a very key discussion we are not going to have now with the time that we have, but we know that the pandemic exposes the frailty of our societies in the face of a global threat in general, and it shows that we are increasing the pressure on the natural world and accelerating the consequences on people and the environment. So includes also climate change. it's a question also of economic resilience and restoration, which may be found via sustainable green economies. So basically, the answer, I mean, basically, we should try and rebuild our economies in a more sustainable way. But yeah, that is for sure something that will be discussed much further in many places. So because we are getting really close to the end of this webinar, my very last question to both Maria José and Beatrice with regards to this link between resource efficient, sustainable consumption, production patterns, and climate change. Do you have examples, or do you know of any analysis of countries that would have included consumer-driven measures or resource efficiency measures more broadly into their nationally determined contributions? Maria José, if you want to start.
Yes, actually, we are going through a process to identify some countries within a collaboration between UNEP and UNDP, as there are a number of countries that might, while it was not maybe intentional, might have both measures on resource efficiency and climate change embedded in their NDCs. So there are some examples of countries. I remember one, Argentina, but I don't know the list of countries, the long list, but there are some countries that have already started experiencing with that. Maybe not on purpose, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to raise awareness about how important that can be to enhance the ambition of NDCs at the moment. Because even with very ambitious measures that are being taken by countries, particularly the big emitters, we have found that this would not be enough to bring global warming down to the limit that is expected by the global community. So we're trying to work with countries, even if they have done it already in a separate way, maybe not as part of their NDCs, but they have a separate resource efficiency policy. We're trying to identify countries that could bring those two together. Yeah, but there are some examples. There is hope.
Thank you very much, Maria José. Beatrice, do you know of any country?
Yeah, I will very quickly. So we don't have any examples of NDCs that actually, at least I'm not aware of, that actually include consumer information tool per se. But we know of countries that are using consumer information tools as one aspect of one way of one instrument to actually achieve their NDCs. For example, in Morocco, they have an NDC on related to low carbon hospitality sector in Morocco. And we have been using labeling, hotels labeling, to actually reduce the emissions from the hospitality sector and helping the achievement of the NDC in Morocco. The same in Ethiopia, we have they have an NDC on on agroforestry, and we are using organic label to the shade coffee to also help them achieve their NDCs on agroforestry. So those are the two that from the top of my mind that I remember.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for those very interesting examples. So we've reached the end of our webinar today. So I would like to thank once again our two presenters for their very rich and interesting contributions. We will be sharing the slides and the recording of the webinar on our website, and we'll be sending an email with links shortly after this webinar. So thank you all for your participation. Thank you to all participants who joined us today. We are very, very glad that we could have you with us today and that we could talk to you today. So thank you once again, and let's keep connected. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Fabienne. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.